Welcome to the 2023 Annual Edwards Lecture. I'm Audrey Macklin, Director of the Center for Criminology and Sociolegal Studies, and I'm delighted to see all of you here. We are thrilled this year to host Professor Dorothy Edwards of University of Pennsylvania Law School as our Edwards Lecturer. And in a moment, I'm going to call on my colleague, Professor Kamari Clark, to introduce Professor Roberts to you. This lecture is named for the founder of the Center for Criminology and Sociolegal Studies, Professor John Llewellyn J. Edwards. Professor Edwards, one of his lesser-known accomplishments is that he was also my first-year criminal law professor. And I have gone on for many years to teach criminal law, although I don't do so anymore. But that makes it a particular honor and pleasure for me to host this event. Now, the land on which the University of Toronto resides is covered by the dish with one spoon Wampum Belt Covenant Treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and Europeans and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Today, this is the territory and Treaty 13 lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations, as well as the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and Haudenosaunee. We are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work in this territory. And with that gratitude comes an obligation to confront the past and the present of settler colonialism in Canada, from the first European settlers to all of us who reside here today, and to recognize the devastation it inflicted on Indigenous peoples. Professor Roberts' recent book, Torn Apart, about which she will speak today, addresses what she calls the United States foster industrial complex, the networked relations of anti-Black racism, privatization, and carcerality that separate and destroy families, especially Black families and communities. She traces the origins of that current foster care regime in the United States to the history of slavery in that country. In Canada, the 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Commission compelled non-Indigenous Canadians to reckon with the ways in which settler colonialism's relentless campaign to dispossess and displace Indigenous peoples from this territory, which we now know as Canada, is an ongoing event. Residential schools were an integral component of the systematic and brutal campaign to eradicate Indigenous cultures, languages, families, and indigeneity itself by apprehending and confining children. More than 150,000 Indigenous children were forced to attend one of the more than 150 residential schools from the 1870s, with the last closing in 1997. Many of you, I think, may be familiar with this painting by Kent Monkman. An exhibition of his work is currently at the Royal Ontario Museum, which depicts the abduction of children from their families and communities through the collaboration of the Canadian state and the churches, primarily the Catholic Church. The violence, anguish, horror, and resistance, and look up in the corner if you missed it, to people escaping this, are vividly portrayed. This past haunts the present, and just a couple of days ago, another unmarked grave of up to 170 children was detected by the Wajushk Onagam Nation on the site of a residential school near Kenora, Ontario. The past of, the violence and the racism of colonialism also lives on in the present. In the 60s scoop, which led to the forcible adoption of Indigenous children by non-Indigenous families, and the ongoing dysfunction of contemporary child welfare systems across Canada, especially, though of course not exclusively, in relation to racialized and Indigenous children. And we also highlight here the discriminatory underfunding and underservicing of Indigenous-led child service programs. It is, though, in the same present that we find resilience, a quest for justice, and a mobilization that creates the will to a better and more just future, we hope. And it is in that spirit that we have come here to both learn from and with Professor Roberts today. And it's now my honor to pass the podium to my colleague, Professor Kamari Clark, Distinguished Professor of Transnational Justice and Socio-Legal Studies, and Interim Director of Diaspora and Transnational Studies, and she will introduce Professor Roberts. After Professor Roberts' lecture, we'll have time for a Q&A from the audience, and then I'll invite you all to join us for a reception. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Audrey. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Dorothy Roberts as the speaker for the 2023 John Edwards Lecture. Professor Roberts is the 14th Penn Integrates Knowledge Professor and is also the George Wise University Professor of Law and Sociology, and she's also the Raymond Pace and Sadie Tanner Mossel Alexander Professor of Civil Rights at the University of Pennsylvania. Now, there's a story there, and I look forward to hearing that story. So that's certainly wonderful. She's an internationally acclaimed scholar, an activist, a lawyer, and social critic, and she's written and lectured extensively on the interplay of race, gender, and class, and in legal issues concerning reproduction, bioethics, and child welfare. She's received awards from the National Science Foundation, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and many more distinguished fellowships. And at UPenn, she's the founding director of the Penn Program on Race, Science, and Society, and this was from 2013 to the present. Now, when I first met Professor Roberts, it was in 2012, but prior to meeting her, I had been teaching her book, certainly long before we met, Killing the Black Body. And at the time, our first encounter, we had both arrived at the same time at the University of Pennsylvania with a profound interest in interrogating the problems of social inequality and the ways that justice had become increasingly a proxy for a discussion of legal justice, but not necessarily a discussion about the rectification of structural inequality. We were also new and with excitement at the time teaching a new generation of young, smart, aspirational young minds. As a professor, a scholar, a lawyer, a social activist, Professor Roberts pierced key questions with brilliance and poise. And I recall feeling comfort in being amongst a colleague who craved fierce intellectual engagement and could also be deployed to advance the cause of social justice. Of course, also at that time, my note to self, because in these institutional academic environments, we have these notes to self, and mine at the time was, Dorothy is the type of public intellectual whose work and commitment and love for teaching and learning has the foundations to change the world. And now, some 10 years later, Professor Roberts, who is certainly at the top of her game, has not settled for less, and in fact, on the contrary, note to self. Her analytic positions have become increasingly precise and empirically clear, and in fact, when I saw her after not seeing her for such a long time, I embraced her, and with pride and with the kind of fierce ways that so much of her work has come together unapologetically in a way that she's taken front stage, and I really, really am thrilled with what her work has become. As Professor Roberts argues in her most recent book, Torn Apart, How the Child Welfare System Destroys Black Families and How Abolition Can Build a Safer World, and I quote, she says, "The child welfare system is structured to cause devastating injuries to children it separates from their families, because its fundamental design is violent and unjust. Family policing produces damaging outcomes for the children it ensnares. On top of inflicting the trauma of separating children from loved ones, state agencies fail to ensure that the children in their custody receive the care that they need and subject them to sexual and physical abuse. The system is set up to interfere with their emotional and physical health, their education, and their social relationships. Foster care criminalizes Black children. And she continues, the family policing system should be judged against the best of our society, that is, the best that our society could offer children and their families. By any ethical measure, it fails abysmally, end quote. And of course, this is just one of so many profound, assertive statements that she makes that are supplemented with data and facts and examples on and on and on throughout the text. And I think we'll see some of that today in her talk. The book is an important offering to those interested in rethinking the interconnections between the carceral state, poverty, political economy, and child welfare. It's certainly a page turner, and we are truly fortunate to have her with us today, and especially in the context of Canada's legacy, Canada's history in relation to Indigenous children, and the child welfare system, and its impact on BIPOC and other families. And so this context here, this city in which we live, is certainly not immune from the critique and the assertions from that book. Now, Roberts was born in Chicago, Illinois. She received her Bachelor of Arts from Yale University and her Juris Doctorate from Harvard Law School. She's been a professor at Rutgers, Northwestern universities, as well as a visiting professor at Stanford and Fordham. A phenomenal and prolific career of writing and publications and policy work and legal briefs. She has published over 100 articles and essays and books, scholarly journals, newspapers, and magazines, including Harvard Law Review, Yale Law Review, the University of Chicago Law Review, Stanford Law Review, Social Text, New York Times. It goes on and on and on, the profound contributions that she's made in the field and the critical interventions that continue to be cited and used for a range of purposes, including contrary purposes, which we saw in her book as well in the second or third chapter. Her books, for those who may be interested in following up on some of that work, it's certainly all over the web, but a couple of them to speak of course, the most recent being Torn Apart, which she'll discuss, some of which she'll discuss today. She's also the author of Fatal Invention, How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century. And here, this book dominates the rise of a new racial politics that relies on reinventing the political system of race as a biological category that is written into our genes, as it were, and obscures deepening racial inequalities in a supposedly post-racial society. And of course, no surprises there, but also in supplementing this work, a tremendous TED Talk that is a 12-minute version of a phenomenal book that I forwarded to all of my engineering and science friends, family, and loved ones. And so if they chose not to read the book, they could certainly watch the TED Talk, which is more likely what some of them will do. But there's also a range of other texts that really have been profound for so many of us doing the work that we do. The 2011 book, Fatal Invention, How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race, and in the 21st century, I've said that. It's Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare, which came out in 2002, as well as Killing the Black Body, Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty, which was published in 1997. And a whole slew of other books and co-edited texts. But I'll just end with a few other notes that really do speak to the tremendous work that political and public intellectual work that Professor Roberts has done, because she's not simply a stellar academic whose work and writing has truly transformed the discipline. She's also an engaged advocate, a public intellectual. She serves on the National Coalition for Child Protection Reform, a national panel that oversees foster care reform in Washington State, and also on the Standards Working Group of the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine that works on stem cell research, and a whole slew of other boards and chairs, including being the chair of the board of directors of the Black Women's Health Imperative. And so in recognition of her tremendous impact to the field, to society, to public policy, she received the 2015 Solomon Carter Fuller Award from the American Psychiatric Association, as well as the 2015-2016 American Council of Learned Societies Fellowship. And some of that is going to her work on a book project on interracial marriage and race inequality in Chicago. And perhaps that there's a biography there as well, which I suspect, we look forward to in the years to come. And so we are truly fortunate to have Professor Roberts with us today to learn from her and to draw inspiration from her work and from the energy that she brings and the commitment that she brings to her work. Her talk today is entitled Family Policing and the Carceral State, A Call for Abolition. Please join me in welcoming our guest, Professor Dorothy Roberts.
Thank you so much for that generous and touching introduction, Professor Clark, and thank you also, Professor Macklin, for the context you gave of similar issues in Canada. My talk is going to be mostly about the United States, actually entirely about the United States, but it's helpful to know that you can relate to these same kinds of violences from the history and ongoing practices in Canada. So I am going to be talking about an aspect of my book, Torn Apart, the intersection of family policing and the criminal legal system, or family policing and the carceral web, a call for abolition. And thank you so much for the invitation to speak to you. It's a great honor. I'm very, very grateful to come to University of Toronto to share my work with all of you. So I'll begin with the story of a family that encountered this intersection of family policing and criminal law enforcement in August of 2021. And we know about it because the father in this case, Mr. Denier, put it live stream what happened to them on Instagram. And we could all see that this family, which included him and Saisha Mercado, who was known to many Americans because she was a finalist on American Idol, maybe some of you in Canada as well. It showed the family being pulled over by deputies of the sheriff's office in Manatee County, Florida. And they pulled the car over and demanded that the parents give over their newborn baby to the caseworkers that were there. So they were surrounded by armed deputies and forced to turn over their baby. Now, this happened because earlier, while Ms. Mercado was pregnant, she had taken their toddler to a hospital in St. Petersburg, Florida, because she was concerned that she was having difficulty transitioning him from breastfeeding to whole foods. And the hospital determined that he was malnourished and claimed that he was showing a failure to thrive. And instead of simply helping the family to take care of him, they took custody of the baby calling the Child Protective Services, and the family had to leave without their toddler, and he was put in foster care. Now that meant that Ms. Mercado and Mr. Denier were under the surveillance of the child welfare system, and so when the baby was born, a judge issued a pickup order to claim this baby and turn it over into state custody as well. And the baby ended up spending 10 days in foster care before they could get her back and they got her back because now there was a lot of public scrutiny of what was going on. You could imagine if they didn't have a team of lawyers fighting for them, this baby might have spent years in foster care. And in fact, their toddler spent quite a bit of time in foster care, at least a year, until they were able to get him back as well. Now, this isn't an exceptional case. It was a case that was presented on live stream so people knew about it, but it exemplifies the kind of connection between the violence of the so-called child welfare system and the violence of criminal law enforcement in the United States, and the way in which caseworkers and police officers collaborate together, and also more deeply, the way in which this system of child protective services and child welfare is deeply entangled with criminal law enforcement and with the logic of carceral approaches to human needs. So let me say a little bit about how I got to this topic. I learned about the child welfare system when I was working on my book, Killing the Black Body, back in the late 1980s. Killing the Black Body was published in 1997. I began work on it in my investigation of the prosecution of Black women who were pregnant and using drugs. And that was really what launched a broader investigation of the long history and current policies that devalue Black women's childbearing. But as I was investigating the prosecutions, I discovered that although there were hundreds of women over time who were being prosecuted for being pregnant and using drugs, there were many, many more Black mothers whose babies were being taken from them at birth because they were accused of using drugs while they were pregnant. And I discovered for the first time how racist this system was. Of course, I was aware there was a child welfare system, but I had no idea how deeply disparate the removal of children, racially disparate the removal of children was in the United States. So when I first began looking at the statistics and ended up writing a book, Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare, that was published in 2001, Black children were the largest group of children in foster care. Now, Black children are a minority of children in the United States. They made up the largest group of children in foster care, and they were 4 times more likely to be removed from their homes than white children. I was living in Chicago at the time, teaching at Northwestern University, and I began to observe hearings before judges related to child removals, and usually it had to do with whether a child had to stay in foster care, how long they had to stay in foster care, what parents had to do to get their children back. And every single family I saw before the court was Black. Every single one. And that makes sense because in Chicago, more than 90% of the children in foster care were Black. It was so obvious that this was a system that targeted Black families. I couldn't understand how there wasn't a national outcry against this. And I had never heard anyone write anything about racism in the child welfare system. I'd never heard this raised as an issue among sociologists who were studying national institutions and looking at racism and other kinds of inequities in powerful institutions. Well, this was an institution that could take people's children away from them. And yet there was no national conversation about it. And so that's why I wrote my book, Shattered Bonds, and began to do policy work to try to improve the system, along with many other people. In fact, over the next decade, the term racial disproportionality began to be used in research and policy related to the child welfare system, and there were efforts to reduce this so-called racial disproportionality so that the gap between the numbers of black children and white children wasn't so large. Now, I discovered, after working in the system to try to improve it, that even though foster care numbers shrank between the time I published Shattered Bonds in 2001 and its 20th anniversary in 2021, and I mentioned the 20th anniversary because I was thinking about writing a preface to update Shattered Bonds. Foster care numbers were smaller, the disproportionality was smaller, but there still was a gross difference in the rate of child removal of black and white children in the United States. And there still were large numbers of children being taken from their families, more than any other Western nation. And this study found that, looking at statistics from 2000 to 2011, looking at the cumulative risk of children being taken from their homes. So in other words, not just looking at a single point in time, what is the difference between the numbers of black and white, the rates of black and white children in foster care, but what is their risk over their entire childhood of being placed in foster care? A much better assessment of the risk. And the study found that Native children, or indigenous children, and black children were the most likely, with Native children being about 15% likely, and or 15% of Native children experiencing foster care by the time they reach age 18, and black children, almost 12% of black children experiencing foster care by the time they reach age 18. Really significant numbers of children being put in state custody. And so they concluded that it is quite common in the United States for these children to experience family separation. In other words, the problem hadn't been solved over the 20 years of task forces and policy makers and researchers trying to end racial disproportionality in the child welfare system. So I spent 9 years, and Professor Clark mentioned this, I actually no longer serve on this task force in Washington State, but for 9 years I served on an expert panel, we called it, of 5 people who were tasked with trying to fix the problems of foster care in Washington State after there was a class action lawsuit brought against the state by foster children for violating their constitutional rights. And a judge found that the state was violating the constitutional rights of these children, not providing them adequate medical care, mental health care, causing too many children to run away. Caseworker caseloads were astronomical, impossible for them to do a good job of caring for these children. Foster parents weren't being trained, just a whole host of problems. And we spent 9 years putting together this detailed plan to get the state to fix its problems. And after 9 years, there was some improvement on some of the measures, but fundamentally, the problems were still there. Over that time, I also began to learn about the abolition movement to end the prison industrial complex. And I was very convinced that the prison industrial complex in the United States needed to be dismantled and replaced with a radically different way of addressing, meeting human needs and solving social problems. And I thought that that framework applied to this system that I was studying and trying to fix, and came to the conclusion it cannot be fixed because it is designed to be violent. It hinges entirely on threatening families to take their children away, or actually taking their children away and putting them in a foster system that we know, it's well documented, is harmful for children. And so because its design is oppressive, it deliberately targets the most marginalized families. It only targets really marginalized families. It's very rare for a wealthy white family, no matter what they do to their children, to be involved in this system. It's designed to deal with the problems and the needs of impoverished or low-income families. So, and it also functions on racist stereotypes. And so it cannot be fixed. Fixing it only legitimizes it. It only strengthens it. A lot of the calls to fix it are pour more money into it. So I came to the conclusion that the system needed to be abolished and replaced with a radically different way of supporting families and caring for children and keeping children safe. I also began to work with a growing movement to abolish the system. It's much, much smaller and less well known than the movement to abolish prisons and police, but it is led primarily by Black mothers who've been involved in the system, whose children have been taken from them and their allies, and it is growing tremendously. Even in the last year, we've made so many gains and have changed the media's approach to it. There are more media, even mainstream media like NBC, CBS. I was on CBS this morning, like this really mainstream kind of show in the United States. And NBC News did a series pointing out the harms and violence of this system, kinds of stories that we never saw even a year ago. And so there's a lot of momentum, and that has been very inspiring to me and many others as well. So it is not a malfunction of the system when children are harmed in foster care, or when we see these statistics of racial disparities in the system. That is what the system is designed to do. And that is why it must be abolished. I have here on the screen, I don't know if you can see it, but two kind of competing messages. One is a t-shirt that these child welfare investigators in a county in Arizona made and wore as a kind of prank, professional kidnappers. And that is exactly what Black mothers told me they felt about the child welfare system when I began doing my research about it. The other is a poster that Joyce McMillan, a Black mother in New York City who founded an organization called JMAC for Families, created and put up. They separate children at the border of Harlem too, to point out that the outrage that Americans expressed when President Trump stepped up the program of separating migrant children from their families at the border, all the trauma that they experienced and that was published in reports and in the press, that was called a violation of human rights and even torture under international conventions. That same trauma is experienced at higher rates in Black communities, routinely, and yet we didn't see that kind of outrage. Deserved outrage, but we should remember that the more routine kinds of family separation operate in a very similar way to punish communities, to keep them from resisting, to disrupt them as a way of maintaining an unequal political system. Another lesson that I learned from prison abolitionists is that it's important to look at the roots of current systems and understand the trajectory of white supremacy and racial capitalism that led to the way they operate today. Yes, there are differences between the origins of these systems and the way they operate today, but we can trace an oppressive trajectory from their foundational design to the way in which they continue to be designed in similar ways today and to target the same marginalized communities that they were designed to target. And so prison abolitionists have pointed out that police today have their roots in slave patrols during the slavery era, that mass incarceration today has its roots in the incarceration of Black people as part of dismantling Reconstruction and re-enslaving Black Americans after they were emancipated through giving police officers massive powers to pick up people off the streets and put them in prison and then lease them out to the corporations that were rebuilding the South. Now, the family policing system, and I perhaps should have explained a little bit more clearly why I call it family policing. I think the terms child welfare, foster care, child protective services are all a form of propaganda to make people believe that these systems are there to serve people, to care for children. They actually operate as policing systems. In fact, they operate very similar to police in the criminal legal system. They operate by accusing parents or other family caregivers. That's the first step. The second step is to investigate them. The next is to either take their children or threaten to take their children. Then they are supervised intensively and given mandates that they must comply with in order to get their children back or to keep their children. And then if they don't comply, they may have their parental rights terminated. And we call that the death penalty of the family policing system because it is the ultimate punishment that families endure, and that's parents and children, because the children also lose their legal rights to have a relationship to their a legal relationship to their families. So we can trace the roots of family policing. Broadly, we can trace them back to enslaving African people because at that time, Black people who were enslaved had no legal rights to their children. Their children were owned, in fact, owned still in the womb by the owner of the enslaved parents. And the slave holder was the patriarch of the entire plantation family and ruled the entire plantation family, not only his own children, but the children of the people he enslaved. There were efforts made to ensure that Black children knew that their parents had no authority over them. They could be sold off at any time, immediately upon arriving in chains in the colonies, or later on at the whim of the slaveholder. And parents were punished in front of their children to prove that they had no power over them, and children were brutally punished in front of their parents without their parents having any ability, legal ability anyway, to protect them. Of course, there was resistance against this, and Black women resisted in many ways against the reproductive enslavement and also the taking of their children and the control over their children. But legally, they had absolutely no authority whatsoever, no claim to their children at all. So we have that deep foundation of 400 years in the United States of the lack of recognition of Black people's family bonds. But then, after emancipation, the effort to re-enslave Black people included not only imprisoning them in the convict lease system, but also the child apprenticeship system, where white people could claim that Black parents were neglecting their children, bring a petition in court, and judges would hold that the children had been neglected, just like judges do today, and the remedy was to apprentice them to former enslavers, sometimes their own former enslavers, and tens of thousands of Black children in the 1860s, after the Civil War, were given back to work for former white enslavers as part of a judicially ordered sanction against their parents. I think there's such a disturbing similarity between the child apprentice system and the foster care system today as it relates to Black families. I would say that that is the origin of the formal child welfare system for Black families. And then, of course, as Professor Macklin pointed out, in Canada, but as well in the United States, child removal was used as a deliberate policy against Indigenous people to destroy Indigenous tribes. And in fact, in the United States, the first removals of Indigenous children were committed by the US military as a weapon of war against Native tribes. So there's a very clear origin when it comes to Indigenous people in the United States of using family separation as a form of violence and oppression against a marginalized population. And even for white children who were treated better than Native and Black children, there was a use of child removal to deal with the problems, the needs of impoverished communities. And that included not only fostering children out against the will of their parents, often, to other families so they could work for them, but also orphan trains that sent thousands and thousands of white children, impoverished white children, mostly immigrant children, from eastern cities like New York to the Midwest and to the Southwest to work on farms. They were advertised as labor, free labor for families. These children who were taken from their families and shipped out to distant farms. Now, the system also has been fueled by stereotypes about Black mothers. And this brings us into the 20th century and the myth of the Black welfare queen that was first begun during the Reagan administration, but perpetuated after that. The idea that Black women had babies just to get a welfare check and then wasted the money on themselves buying luxury items and didn't really care for their children at all. This is a very powerful, well-known, well-circulated myth about Black mothers, and also the idea that Black women's childbearing itself was a social problem that needed to be regulated and even prevented. Now, there is lots of evidence that part of the reason that Black children are more likely to be removed from their homes is because of racial bias by people who report child abuse and neglect and professionals who then decide what to do about it. And I'll just give a couple examples of that. The number of studies have found that doctors are more likely to suspect Black parents of child abuse when they bring their children to the emergency room with injuries like long bone fractures. In fact, some of these studies indicate that white children are more likely to, the abuse against white children is more likely to be missed because doctors don't suspect that white parents would hurt their children as much as they do. And then the very well documented the racial bias in testing drugs, testing newborns and mothers for drugs, and reporting it to Child Protective Services. And although the law on this is very ambiguous in the United States, there aren't clear protocols for when there should be testing or what to do about the testing. Doctors generally are mandated reporters, and so if they want to, it's not really mandatory because they don't report wealthy patients who use drugs. They report disproportionately impoverished Black patients who use drugs. This is why when people talk about mandated reporting, I say it's just it's a false idea. It's biased reporting, and the mandate is an excuse to report certain families. There's also evidence of bias in caseworker reporting, and I'll just mention one study which I think is such an interesting experiment to find out whether there was bias in reporting in Minnesota, and an interesting hypothesis that Black disproportionality in reported and substantiated child neglect hinges on how and whether caseworkers visualize Black versus white neglect situations. Their hypothesis was that if neglect looks Black, then it's more likely perceived as to be substantiated compared to neglect in a white situation. And what they did is they gave caseworkers who already were going to get this training module, they showed them vignettes, or told them vignettes with these pictures. I don't know if you could see it, but of messy home. So messy home can be a reason to investigate and charge a parent with neglect. So they gave them an image of a messy room without a baby, a messy room with a Black baby, and a messy room with a white baby. Same messy room. And they found that the caseworkers were substantially more likely to find neglect when it was an image of a Black baby. Now, this reinforces the other research that has shown that it takes more for a caseworker to substantiate child maltreatment or remove a child if the child is white than if the child is black. In other words, they're more willing to take children away from black families for the exact same kinds of problems than they are white families. And again, why is that? I think it goes to, and this has been substantiated by research as well, to the idea that black parents are deficient, that there isn't really a strong, loving bond between black parents and black children, that black children are better off away from their families than with their families. And so there's a greater ease in taking black children away from their families. This idea that black children are being saved when they're taken away from their families. So lots of evidence of racial bias, but the racial bias is in the context of and supports the systemic way in which family policing operates to support a racial capitalist political structure. And one way of understanding this is to explore the laws that were passed in the United States in the 1990s under a Democratic administration, Democratic President Clinton, that decimated the welfare state in the United States, as weak as it was to begin with, and supported private solutions to people's needs, and then harsh punishment for people and communities that were unable to function, to thrive in this extra stingy economic approach. And so there's really 3 laws. I'm not going to go into all of them for sake of time, but we had a crime control bill that was passed that built up greater police presence in black communities, passed in 1993 or 94. This is the one that Biden got a lot of heat for because he supported it, and it was a very racist law that now is well recognized for being one of the reasons why the prison system continued to build up through the 1990s. But let me focus on 2 other laws that were passed in the 1990s. One was the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act in 1996. That's the law that ended the federal entitlement to assistance for needy families in the United States. So in 1996, Congress ended any federal right to support to raise your children in the United States and handed that over, the money over to states to decide whatever they wanted to do to support families. And that included then states passing laws that were aimed at pushing impoverished women into low-wage work, getting them married. This doesn't really work, but this is their idea of what's going to help families, getting them married and discouraging them from having more children. At this very next year, another law was passed which gets far less attention, the Adoption and Safe Families Act. And that was a law that was addressing what was perceived as this exploding foster care population, which had been growing from the 1960s into the 1990s, mainly because that is when black children began to be encompassed by the child welfare system. Prior to that, prior to the civil rights movement, black children were ignored by the formal child welfare system. And then as black children began to and black families got welfare rights and began to be noticed by the child welfare system, the policy changed from providing services to intact families, again, almost all white families, to taking children from their homes. And so we see this exploding foster care population as we're seeing the growth of black child removal. And as I said, by 2000, black children were the largest group of children in foster care. And the response to that, even by Democrats, was that the problem was that too many black children were languishing in foster care, and the solution wasn't to support their families so they could stay home. The solution was to terminate parental rights and get the children adopted. And some advocates explicitly said it was to terminate black mothers' rights to free them, this is the language used, to free them from their mothers so they could be adopted by white families. Now think about the confluence of these two policies, ending the welfare safety net while speeding up termination of parental rights of families whose children have been taken from them, mostly on grounds of neglect. And let me emphasize that in the United States, only about 16 or 17% of children are put in foster care for physical or sexual abuse. The vast majority are there for neglect, which is conflated with poverty. What is neglect? Is failure to provide clothing for your child, failure to provide adequate nutrition, failure to provide housing, failure to provide an adequate education or medical care. So it's the first time in US history where the federal government said to states, you must protect children mainly by taking them away from their families, and if they don't comply fast enough, speeding up termination of parental rights. So the law said that if children have been in foster care 15 out of the last 22 months, the state must petition to terminate the parents' rights. Okay, so they must do this, but at the same time, we're not going to provide them a guaranteed support for their children. Now, that violence and trauma and terrorizing of families that goes on in the family policing system is deeply entangled with the criminal legal system in America on a number of levels. One simple way it's entangled is that caseworkers sometimes bring police officers along with them when they go to investigate homes. And so the police can be a backup for caseworkers to add extra terror to families, to let them in their homes and to make them comply, in fact, sometimes to sign voluntary agreements that they'll give up their children, or to sign blank permission to collect all sorts of information about the family. It also helps the police, because the police now have the imprimatur of child protection. To gain access to information, they would have to, if they follow the Constitution, get a warrant for, or deal with a criminal defendant's or a suspect's lawyer. Most of these families don't have lawyers when the caseworker knocks on the door, and so they work with the police in this mutually beneficial relationship. And some of this is formalized in contracts and task forces. I have an image here of a task force that includes caseworkers and police officers to investigate allegations of child abuse and neglect. These systems are also connected to mass incarceration. Mass incarceration is one of the main reasons why there's so many black children in foster care, because when parents are incarcerated, their children are often placed in foster care. And also, because of the Adoption Safe Families Act timeline, some judges have ruled that if a parent is going to be incarcerated for more than a year or 15 months, that is automatic grounds to terminate their parental rights, because there's no way they'll be able to maintain a close enough relationship with their child. And I probably don't have to tell you that there's a huge racial disparity in incarceration in the United States. Black children are much more likely to have an incarcerated parent than white children, and incarceration of parents is itself a form of racial domination in the United States. Now, it's possible, and I would argue, that in some ways caseworkers have even more power than police officers with less public scrutiny, because it's well known that police officers need a warrant to search a home. They have to prove probable cause to search a home. It is extremely uncertain what the legal rules are with respect to child welfare investigations. I would say that, I mean, we know I'm not just saying this, the Fourth Amendment applies to any government agent that wants to search your home in the United States, but it is not applied to caseworkers. As Tarek Ismail wrote in a forthcoming article in California Law Review, the relative dearth of case law on the subject, even more remarkable than the relative dearth of case law. Again, people don't seem to think this is an important topic, so there isn't a lot of case law on the powers of caseworkers to search people's homes and do other things as well, remove children without justification, etc. But more remarkable than that is the conclusion some courts have reached that these investigations are outside the familiar rules regulating law enforcement searches of homes. In other words, there's a virtual exemption for caseworkers from the Fourth Amendment. No grounds for that. And his article goes at great length at showing why the Fourth Amendment should apply. But even if it did apply, caseworkers have something even more powerful than police officers, which is the threat that they will take your children away. And that's the main reason why people let them in, because they threaten. If you don't let us in, we will assume you're neglecting or abusing your child, and it'll be worse for you. Although we are engaged in a campaign in the US to let parents know their legal rights. That's certainly better than the state that exists now. And in fact, there's legislation pending in New York State, kind of Miranda rights legislation, that caseworkers have to tell parents their legal rights, and the Administration for Children's Services is opposing this law, opposing having to tell people of their legal rights. Let me just pause a minute. Well, how am I doing on time? I am very bad at keeping track. Okay, all right, thank you. Now, another way in which criminal law enforcement parallels and is similar to the family policing system is in racialized surveillance of people. As you may know, I'm not sure what's going on in criminal law enforcement in Canada, but in the United States, there's been a huge increase in predictive analytics and police departments using artificial intelligence and algorithms and big databases to predict hotspots for crime and to identify, both to predict communities that are hotspots for crime where they bring in lots of police, or to identify individuals who are at risk of committing future crimes. And quite a literature critiquing this, newspaper stories all the time, pointing out mistakes that police have made in identifying someone through AI as committing a crime when the person didn't commit the crime. This kind of predictive analytics is being used more and more by family policing departments, with child welfare departments in large cities like Chicago, Los Angeles, hiring corporations that specialize in data collection and predictive analytics to set up risk assessment tools and alert tools for these departments. This has also a widespread impact in Black communities, partly because these risk assessments import data that is biased against Black people, and also because Black children are extremely likely to be the subject of child maltreatment investigations. So similar to that study I pointed out that looked at the cumulative risk over the course of one's childhood from birth to 18 of being taken from your families, a similar study looked at the lifetime prevalence or over childhood of being investigated for child maltreatment. And it found that most Black children in America will be the subject of a child welfare investigation before they reach age 18. This is perhaps the most startling statistic I've read in all of my research. 53% of Black children will be subject to an investigation. Just to think about what that means about the role of this very intrusive and traumatizing government apparatus in Black children's lives and in Black communities. The United States is extremely racially segregated. And imagine in Black communities, and this means that in impoverished Black communities, the rates are even higher in some of these communities. So it means that every Black child in that community either has been subject to an investigation or knows someone who's been subject to an investigation. I did a tiny study of this in 2006 of a Black community in Chicago. I called it the racial geography of child welfare because I thought it was important to look at what is the impact of such concentrated child welfare agency involvement in a neighborhood. You know, this is not reflected in statistics about the numbers of Black children versus white children in foster care or even under investigation. Because when it's concentrated in a neighborhood, it's not just the families that have experienced investigations, it's all the neighbors as well, right? Because they all know that this is going on. And that's what I found, that everyone, it was a tiny study, I only interviewed 25 Black women, but they all were aware of the system. They called it the system, which indicated to me that this was the most powerful system in their lives. And everyone knew about it. They all thought that high numbers of families had been affected by it. And they all told me about negative things that this system did. They all saw it as a system that was designed to take children away. And I'll just mention, I wasn't going to talk about the study, but I'll just mention one other thing. I called an article, I wrote about it, the paradox of the racial geography, because when I asked them, is DCFS too involved in your neighborhood? Not involved enough or involved just the right amount, most said it's not involved enough. And I was so surprised because they all said it disrupts children's lives. People use it to retaliate against each other. You know, it's only here to take children away. But it was one of the few financial resources that they had in the neighborhood. And many of the mothers were kin caregivers, and they were getting a stipend to take care of their relatives, much larger than the stipend that the relatives would get in welfare benefits. So it actually was financially advantageous, you know, for grandma to take care of the child and be a licensed foster caregiver than for the mother of the child to keep custody and get puny welfare benefits. So again, another way in which this system is designed to be disruptive. You only get the benefits, though, and they pointed this out to me, if you give up custody of your child. So just to give an idea of the kinds of sweeping information that these companies collect about families and how they use predictive analytics to identify at-risk children who then, you know, whose families now are going to get investigated. Just some of the language that SAS, this big corporation that does this kind of data collection, boasts on its website. You know, it's comprehensive. They access child-related data no matter where it is stored. A hybrid analytical approach. Only SAS applies multiple analytical techniques, business rules, anomaly detection, predictive modeling, social network analysis, geospatial analysis, etc. I love how they're boasting about it. To me, it sounds so scary, but this is what the child welfare agencies want, right? They're paying millions of dollars for this. Advanced social network analytics. Identify individuals associated with an at-risk child and capture important data about them. Criminal histories, behavioral health data, drug or alcohol treatment data, etc. Associated with the child. What does that mean? Their neighbors? Their friends? Family friends? And what is all this data they're collecting about this network of people? And then automated monitoring risk scores are continuously recalculated based on the most up-to-date information, and an alert engine proactively notifies caseworkers when risk thresholds are exceeded. Now, I recognize that some people might say, well, that's good. Okay, so you're making more precise assessments of children who are at risk of abuse and neglect and getting in there before the harm occurs. But hopefully you can also think about what that means to predict based on biased data who is at risk. And investigations are not nice things. They're traumatic, and they put families at risk of losing their children. And so we really have to question any kind of procedure that's in place to identify families that are going to be investigated by the family policing system, as well as the implications of all of this data about people that are being collected by these companies. Now, another connection with criminal law enforcement is the way in which family policing criminalizes Black children. This is a long-standing aspect of both the juvenile legal system and adult criminal legal system in the United States. One of my former students, a PhD from Northwestern, Tara Eva Ajapong, wrote a book called The Criminalization of Black Children that shows the history of how the early juvenile legal system treated Black children harshly, differently than white children, and also often put dependent Black children who needed care in the juvenile legal system rather than the emerging child welfare system. There's data that show that being in foster care increases the risk that children will be put in the juvenile legal system and juvenile detention. In the US, there are terms for dually involved children, crossover youth. These are youth who are involved in both systems, or usually they start out in the foster system and get put into the juvenile detention system. Because the foster system is structured that way, it's not because something's wrong with these children, they're just bad kids and that's why they end up. It is structured that way because group homes and other kinds of congregate care, as well as foster parents, are much more likely to call the police on children if there's a problem in the home. Plus, they put these children who have been traumatized, including because they've been separated from their families and friends and classmates, together in very volatile situations. And then if a fight breaks out, they call the police on them. And that's how they're being pushed into the juvenile detention system, as well as runaways. Many children run away from foster placements, and the approach then is to call the police on them. I say in the book, there's a thin line between dependency and delinquency. Children very easily, especially Black teenagers, go from being dependent children who need the care of the state to delinquent children, or even adult people considered criminals who are incarcerated. And especially children who age out of foster care are at very high risk of experiencing prison shortly after they age out. In addition, children who are considered to have behavioral problems, or sometimes if there just isn't a placement for them, they are put in what's called residential treatment facilities in the United States, which often house both children adjudicated delinquent and children who have been taken from their parents through the civil child welfare system. And these places often are like prisons. Children are kept confined and they're treated extremely harshly. And I have here images of 2 children who were recently killed by staff in residential treatment centers. Cornelius Fredericks, when he threw a piece of bread in the cafeteria, and David Hess in Philadelphia, who was killed when staff came into his room looking for a missing iPad. Then there's also, most fundamentally, the carceral logic of both the family policing system and the criminal legal system, structuring government policy to impede care for families and children, to impede resistance against oppression, and to divert attention away from social change. So the underlying philosophy of family policing is that the reason for child maltreatment is parents' pathology. And the solution is therapeutic remedies like parent training classes and therapeutic counseling. Not that the problem is child poverty. Not that the problem is the structural reasons why there is inadequate housing for families. Not the structural reasons why there's inadequate income for families, inadequate education, inadequate health care. all of these inadequacies are deemed to be child neglect that is the fault of deficient parents. And that philosophy then merges with racist stereotypes about Black families as deficient and not caring for their children. And we end up with not only the disparities, but also with a system that functions to deal with the problems of these marginalized communities through this punitive approach, which is the same way that prisons function as well in the United States. So what are called preventive services are services to prevent children from being put in foster care. They apply to families that are seen as, identified as risk of maltreating their children. But getting these so-called services, which are mandated, they're not what the families request. The families aren't consulted about what they need. They're told, this is what you have to do. That's what the service is. And then if they don't comply, their children are taken from them or kept in foster care. This actually has the opposite impact of caring for families, because what it means is that, and a wonderful new sociologist, Kelly Fong in the United States, has been writing about this. She has a book coming out about this. What it means is that families who are in need of services and care and support are afraid of the very people and institutions that are supposed to help them, because they're the ones that will report them. So teachers, doctors, social service providers are all mandated reporters, and families are deterred from dealing with them in a way that would really help them, because they're afraid that it's going to end up with them having their children taken from them. So it is counterproductive. Women who are being abused in the home, victims of intimate partner violence, again, studies that show this, are afraid, many of them, to get help, to leave the situation or to deal with the violence going on in the home, because they're afraid they'll be considered neglectful parents. And in many states, being a survivor of domestic violence makes you an unfit parent. And so they don't report it because they're afraid their children will be taken away. This is just one of many examples of how this punitive approach makes children less safe, not more safe, and is similar in its logic to the criminal punishment system. So, what do we do about this? What do we do about this entanglement of family policing and the prison industrial complex in this carceral web, where it is an integrated apparatus that claims to meet human needs by punishing people, by surveillance, by accusation, investigation, punishment. Whether it's prison or terminating parental rights, whether it's parole or supervision by caseworkers, whether it's accusation of criminal neglect or accusation of civil neglect. It's got the same logic to deal with the problem, and this is especially evident when it comes to family policing, of unmet needs of children. And so I believe that the answer is abolition. We have to abolish the family policing system. And by that I mean dismantling it incrementally. And one way that activists are working on that, and here's an image of Joyce McMillan testifying before the New York State Assembly. She has and her organization, JMAC for Families, and a network she's brought together of lawyers and families that have been impacted by the system and activists, has proposed a slate of legislation, including that Miranda rights legislation I mentioned. So one way is passing laws that will limit the power of the family policing system to investigate and disrupt families. And in other ways, shrink its power, its breadth, its size. But at the same time, we have to build true supports for families, ways that actually keep children safe. We know that the child welfare system has failed to do that. Children are harmed in foster care. And, most of the accusations against families are unsubstantiated. So families go through these intense traumatic investigations, and at the end, the caseworkers don't substantiate it, and then they leave. And you have families that do have needs, and they don't get anything. So it's not just the families whose kids are taken from them, it's also all the families who are left without any support. And this system supports that way of addressing children's needs. So we have to build other ways, community-based ways of meeting children's needs. And also, I happen to be a supporter of government income directed into the hands of families. There's a debate, maybe we could talk about this during Q&A, but debate about to what extent abolishing the family policing system and other oppressive systems should include the state. I think that it's a good idea for the government to hand out checks to people to be able to afford what their children need. So that's one other possibility. And of course, the structural changes that we would need to make sure that every family has health care, every family has adequate income, every family has housing, has education, and we need structural change as well. But again, the system we have now impedes that change because it pretends as if the problems of children are caused by their dysfunctional families and that it's solving it through this investigative and punitive approach. And then we also have to grapple with the fact that there are family members who harm children. And we want to prevent that harm as much as possible. But the family policing system does a terrible job of that. And in fact, most of the stories, until very recently we heard, sometimes the only stories we heard about the child welfare system in America was when a child was killed at home, although it was known, quote, known to the system. These are cases where the system failed to protect the children, and yet the response to it is almost always, we need more caseworkers, we need more money poured into the system. And we know that when that happens, caseworkers, and what happens is there are more and more reports of child abuse and neglect, and caseworkers become overwhelmed and less able to investigate the cases where there's real harm going on in the family at the hands of parents. But we also know from the prison industrial complex, abolitionists, and others, especially from anti-carceral feminists, that there are approaches to make people accountable for harm, to heal relationships, to compensate survivors, and to get at the root of why there is so much intimate violence in our societies. I'm not sure of the statistics in Canada, but in the United States, they're astronomical. And it's very clear that the punitive carceral approach has failed. In fact, evidence that, especially for Black women, calling the police increases the risk that the survivor will be killed. So why continue with an approach that has failed to give true safety and support? And why not work toward a reimagined approach that is based not on punishing people, but on actually caring and supporting for people, that looks at the reasons for violence and gets at those reasons, that holds people accountable for violence instead of scaring away the victims from getting help. And so I will leave you with a call to think about abolition, to learn about it, and to find ways that you might get involved in ending this terroristic and terribly harmful system and working toward a society that truly cares for children, truly keeps them safe as much as possible, better than we're doing now, and supports families. Thank you.